Hi, I'm Ted Yacucci. Thank you so much for tuning into the channel. Well, yesterday I released a video in which I claim that the plot, the conspiracy to murder President John Kennedy back in 1963 was absolutely massive, not compartmentalized, not small, but massive. And I identified about 40 people that I think we can demonstratively prove were part of either the planning or the operation of the murder that took place in Dealey Plaza. What I did was use initials rather than the actual names, and I thank so many of you for yesterday or overnight or today taking the time to write in the comment box and see if how many of the initials you could identify that I put in there, and also a lot of you made comments about people that you think should be on the list that maybe I didn't include. So let's go ahead before long. We'll talk about each of these, but let's go ahead and identify now by showing the names, replace the initials with names, and then we'll go and we'll talk about each one of them. And starting at the very top, in my opinion, we have Allen Dulles, who I think was one of the worst human beings to ever walk the earth. Along with Allen Dulles comes Richard Bissell and Charles Cabell, his deputy director and his deputy director of plans. All three went to the CIA. Dulles was the first civilian CIA director in 1953. They were all fired by JFK after the Bad Pigs debacle, in which they lied to him in 1962. Along in that same category, we have James Angleton, chief of counterintelligence for the CIA, and the man who ran the fake defector programs into the Soviet Union, into Russia, that Lee Oswald was part of. After that, we have Curtis LeMay, head of the Air Force, and a known militant in the sense that he was a segregationist, ran actually for vice president of the United States later, and continually butted heads with President Kennedy, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis. After that, we have President Lyndon Johnson, who I think had to be involved, and we'll talk about him more. And then one other name, James Rowley, the head of the Secret Service. And I apologize, somehow I left this name off, and I felt so badly last night when I realized it. James Rowley was the head of the Secret Service back in 1963, and he was also the person that bottled up the Chicago plot. He called the agent in charge, Maurice Martineau, there in Chicago, and instructed him to bottle up the results of what had happened in Chicago, and because of that, a lot of the agents in Dallas and other people in Dallas never even knew that an assassination attempt had taken place in Chicago just 3 weeks earlier. And James Rowley also was instrumental in the fake autopsy after President Kennedy was killed, when they brought his body back to Washington for the autopsy. So that is the inception or the planning group. Then we have the operation planning group: Carlos Marcello, New Orleans Mafia; Win Scott, CIA; David Atlee Phillips, most people know about him; CIA Richard Helms, who would be the later director of the CIA; Henry Cabot Lodge, involved in as ambassador to Vietnam, and very, very instrumental in making sure that the Diem brothers were kidnapped and killed on the exact day that President Kennedy was to be killed in Chicago. That was all kind of tied together, and they were supposed to happen on the same day. Frank Wisner is the CIA, and then the GB, which was difficult for a lot of folks, was Guy Bannister. You remember Guy Bannister in New Orleans, and Lee Oswald had a office in Bannister's office, and also Bannister, of course, was the ex FBI station chief in Chicago before he moved to New Orleans. The next group, the action planning, that's Earl Cabell, the brother of Charles Cabell, and Earl Cabell was the mayor of Dallas. We have Ed Lansdale. We have Haroldson Hunt. Haroldson Hunt was of course, a very a tycoon in oil and also extremely right-wing, who met with a lot of people in his building, including Jack Ruby, the day before the assassination. Carlos Bernier of the anti-Castro Cubans, Ann Goodpasture, who was the right-hand man for the CIA in the Mexico City office, Cord Mayer, Frank Sturgis, both CIA. We have Clay Shaw, who, of course, Jim Garrison brought to trial, and then David Morales, who was also CIA. And again, we'll talk about each of these people and why they belong on this list in just a moment, but we want to go ahead and just get all the names out first. So for the assassination execution, the teams that were on the ground, Roscoe White. Yes, I believe Roscoe White was definitely a part of that operation. J.D. Tippit. We all know about J.D. Tippit. David Ferry, very instrumental again, with Guy Bannister and the New Orleans group. Eugene Brading, who was caught in Dallas and, of course, said his name was Jim Braden, so he lied about that, got away. He was also present a few years later when Robert Kennedy was killed in Los Angeles. Sam Giancana, the mafia head in Chicago, Morgan Brown, Jack Ruby, Antonio Viziana, W.R. Westbrook, and Kenneth Croy were part of in my opinion, part of the plot that had infiltrated into the Dallas police. And then, of course, we have E. Howard Hunt, and most people know about him. Moving to the last category, prior knowledge, Rose Cheramy. We know that she was the person that was kind of ejected from the car, and then in the hospital she related that she had knowledge of what was going to happen in a few days in Dallas, and turned out to be true. Billy Sol Estes was a right-hand man of President Lyndon Johnson, involved in a lot of nasty dealings, and I believe he was privy to what was going on. John Rosselli, who had dealt originally with Charles Cabell, taking $150,000 of CIA money to assassinate Fidel Castro. The next two were very, very difficult, and I know a lot of people had problems with them. They're on there only because of my personal investigations into Chicago, where I traveled several times when I was trying to get some more information and file some FOIA acts about the Chicago plot. They stand for Peter Shurla and Daniel Groth. Peter Shurla and Daniel Groth. They are two officers who were also CIA related, who were assigned to follow Thomas Arthur Valet around all night. And Valet, as many of you know, would have been the Lee Oswald, would have been the patsy that was set up in Chicago. Well, they didn't arrest Mr. Valet until John Kennedy's plane until John Kennedy had made the decision that he was not going to travel to Chicago. It was only after the president's trip was canceled did Shurla and Groth go ahead and arrest Thomas Valet. So they had to know that that plot was happening in Chicago, and they had to know that those plotters, those conspirators, weren't going to quit in Chicago. After that, Joseph Miltier, the right-wing Floridian, who many of us have heard the undercover tapes with William Somerset, in which he pretty much spelled out exactly what was going to happen in Dallas. And there is there's film of a person on the street that is probably Joseph Miltier, from everything that I can tell, at least. The one person that I apologize that didn't get put on this list, and it should have been towards the top, was William K. Harvey, a CIA operative who, I don't know how I left him off the list when I was originally making it out, but he was very, very tight with E. Howard Hunt, and probably had a lot to do with at least the planning of the actual assassination attempt. So they're the names that replace the initials, and I'm wondering how many of them that you agree with and how many of them maybe you don't agree with. You know, it's subjective, but they're the ones. There's other people that I would have liked to have put on here, of course, but these are the ones that I feel that I can really argue about and make a really solid case for their participation in either the plotting of the assassination or the carrying out of the assassination, or at the very least, their knowledge of what was to happen. You know, I can do a lot of talking about Alan Dulles and Eric Bell and all of the planners, the people who I believe came up with the idea of getting rid of John Kennedy, just the same way that they had gotten rid of Mogadishu in Iran and Arbenz Guzman in Guatemala, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. So many overturns of coups is what they were, of democratically elected governments, all in the name of American business, profit, and so many folks died in those countries as a result of the chaos that they created. So I could, you know, try to delineate it, but I have done a video a couple years ago, and it's I think it really does a pretty good job of really talking about all of these guys and in a lot more detail that I could talk about now, and it'll give you an idea of exactly why I feel that these people, there's just no question that they were involved in the setup of the assassination on President Kennedy. So let's do this. I'm gonna include that video now, if you would watch it, and it'll give you all the information that you need about those people in that top category or two. And then in the next video, we'll move down and we'll talk about all the people in the other categories. Thank you so much for watching. I really, really appreciate it. And again, thank you so much for all of you that took time to comment. And, you know, you opened my eyes to a lot of things too, and I really appreciate that.
We have the Chicago plot, which is so similar to what happened in Dallas. You know, so, I mean, how could that be covered up by Castro? How could that be covered up by the mafia? You know, how could that be covered up by the KGB? That it was just a coincidence that both those plots were so similar to each other? See, clearly somebody was saying, we got to get rid of this guy, and we have to get rid of him in the fall of 1963. We can't let him run the risk of being reelected. You know, we can't get rid of him during an election campaign. We have to get rid of him now. That clearly seems to be the message of those two plots in November. Somebody's hunting down Kennedy. He's not getting out of 1963 alive.
Track down the President of the United States? Make sure President Kennedy didn't get out of 1963 alive? Who would have the power and the resources to even consider such a thing?
After World War II, the U.S. kind of stepped up on the world scene. England was broke, you know, the old empire was bust. Everybody looked to America to lead the world, and it became clear that you needed a good intelligence service in every major country to be able to do that.
President Harry S. Truman signed the National Security Act in 1947, creating the Central Intelligence Agency. Problems with oversight and unmonitored CIA activities began 2 years later when Congress passed the Central Intelligence Agency Act. The act provided that CIA funds could be included in the budgets of other departments and then transferred to the agency without restriction to the initial appropriation. Basically, secret funding that very few could trace. As you may expect, some senators and congressmen were not in favor, warning that the CIA would set up a military Gestapo in the United States. Congressional fears grew when the CIA created a covert action wing called the Office of Policy Coordination, led by Wall Street lawyer Frank Wisner, and it didn't take long for the fears to become reality. Later in 1949, Wisner established Mockingbird, a program to influence foreign media. Philip Graham from the Washington Post was recruited to run the project within the industry, and soon leading members of many of America's most read newspapers and magazines were being influenced. An investigation by respected journalist Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame revealed that one of the most important journalists under Mockingbird's control was Joseph Alsop, whose foreign affairs articles appeared in over 300 different newspapers. Project Mockingbird really accelerated when Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected president in 1952. Eisenhower's vice president was Richard Nixon, who had become known for his work in trying to prove that American government official Alger Hiss was a communist. Nixon echoed Senator Joseph McCarthy's assertions that communists were infiltrating every aspect of American life.
And I say that any man who called the Alger Hiss case a red herring isn't fit to be president of the United States. I say that a man who, like Mr. Stevenson, has poo-pooed and ridiculed the communist threat in the United States. He said that they are phantoms among ourselves. He has accused us that have attempted to expose the communists of looking for communists in the Bureau of Fisheries and Wildlife.
McCarthy's claims grew so overwhelming that on December 2, 1954, the Senate voted to censor him. Also coming into power with Eisenhower was Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, and, shortly after, Dulles' brother Allen, who became the first civilian CIA director. Both were Eastern establishment lawyers who had questionable dealings with Nazi officials before and after World War II, and had been accused by some with money laundering for their corporate clients. Allen Dulles personally took over and accelerated the Mockingbird project, placing CIA reports with both knowing and unknowing reporters, then watching those reports be cited and repeated throughout the media wire services. In the 1950s, some 3,000 salaried and contract CIA employees were engaged in propaganda efforts. Even worse, Wisner and Dulles were also able to restrict newspapers from reporting about certain events. For example, the CIA plots to overthrow the governments of Iran and Guatemala.
And then they realized, the easy way to get people, to protect American business investments was to control foreign governments. And in Iran in 1953, the British had come and asked for help because Iran was making noises about nationalizing its oil that Britain was especially dependent on. U.S. was not, but Britain was. And so we worked with them to overthrow Mossadegh in Iran and install the Shah, who became a much hated figure, and the Ayatollah and the fundamentalism that we see in Iran today is a direct reaction to the Shah, who we put in, who is essentially a fascist, who ran the country like a dictator.
Flush with success with the Iran overthrow, the CIA almost immediately decided to overthrow President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman of Guatemala. The United Fruit Company, in which both Dulles brothers were major stockholders, owned hundreds of thousands of acres of land in Guatemala, along with the railroad system, the telegraph system, and controlled nearly all of the country's trade. When President Arbenz tried to diversify the country's agriculture and provide land for poor peasants, the Dulles brothers led the opposition, under the guise of worrying about a communist threat. The CIA's own website calls the agency's overthrow of President Arbenz one of its most shameful moments. Ultimately, President Eisenhower became concerned that CIA covert activities were being poorly coordinated with American foreign policy, and might even be working primarily for senior corporate interests centered on upper-class families of the Northeastern establishment. Eisenhower appointed David Bruce to investigate the agency. The results of the Bruce Report were released in 1956. The report was very critical of the agency's interference into the operations of democratically elected governments. Further, the report was exceedingly critical of Operation Mockingbird. So now one of the questions that many people have about the Kennedy assassination begins to be answered. How could the facts of the murder be covered up so quickly and thoroughly? Well, the same way the American public was never told the truth about the CIA overthrow in Iran or Guatemala. It was simply business as usual with an American press that was under the direct influence of an unregulated intelligence agency with its own policy-making desires. Want a perfect example? Think about the famous Zapruder film, the best visual record of the Kennedy assassination. Life magazine publisher Henry Luce purchased the film within 48 hours of the Kennedy murder, not to show it to the public, but to lock it away for as long as possible. Why? Still not quite convinced? Well, let's look at some of the other actions of our unregulated CIA under Director Allen Dulles in the 1950s. The agency began extensive research into mind control with its MK-Ultra program, using US and Canadian test subjects, usually without their knowledge or permission. MK-Ultra tried to manipulate mental states and alter brain functions through the administration of drugs and other chemicals, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and verbal and sexual abuse. Many experiments used the drug LSD. In one series of experiments, subjects were administered LSD for 77 consecutive days. At least one death was attributed to MK-Ultra, but many more are suspected. CIA Director Richard Helms purposefully and illegally destroyed MK-Ultra files in 1973 when ordered to appear before a congressional committee. If all of this wasn't enough, the CIA got Eisenhower's permission to set up an undercover organization called Operation 40 in 1959. The infamous group included Frank Sturgis, who would become a Watergate burglar, Felix Rodriguez, a CIA officer who would later murder revolutionary Che Guevara in cold blood, Luis Posada, who was demanded by Venezuela for his key role in blowing up a Cuban passenger airliner, and Orlando Bosch, founder of the group that organized the murder of a Chilean former minister. Operating with little or no oversight, Operation 40 exploded a ship under a Belgian flag in Havana Bay, killing or injuring 275 people, mostly civilians. Over the next few years, Operation 40 worked closely with several anti-Castro Cuban organizations, including Alpha 66. The most violent of the Eisenhower-approved, U.S.-supported Cuban paramilitary groups that trained in the Everglades. Alpha 66 was a group directed by David Atlee Phillips, chief of covert action at the CIA's Mexico City station. In early 1963, Atlee Phillips was so out of control that he deployed Alpha 66 in attacks on Russian ships in Cuban ports. The purpose of the provocative raids was to draw JFK into a war with Cuba. Later in 1963, Win Scott, another CIA operative, will actually send raiding parties into Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, again trying to force JFK into military conflict. So from 1953 on, we've got a CIA who controls what Americans will read through their Operation Mockingbird, a CIA who is setting their own policy of assassinations and overthrowing democratically elected governments for their own members' monetary and ideologic purposes, a CIA conducting drug and mind control experiments on American citizens without their consent. It just can't get any worse than this. Can it?
Could you tell this committee who the individuals were involving mafia chieftains or organized crime figures?
As far as I'm aware, on that particular situation, it was William K. Harvey who was in touch with John Roselli.
It is likely that at the very moment President Kennedy was shot, a CIA officer was meeting with a Cuban agent in Paris and giving him an assassination device for use against Castro.
I believe it was a hypodermic syringe they'd given him with something called black leaf number 40 in it.
In September 1960, CIA Director Allen Dulles and his Director of Operations Richard Bissell initiated talks with two leading figures of the Mafia, Johnny Rosselli and Sam Giancana, to assassinate Cuban President Fidel Castro. The plan was authorized by President Eisenhower. Later, other crime bosses such as Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and Meyer Lansky became involved in the plot. The CIA offered the Mafia $150,000 to kill Fidel Castro. The advantage of employing the Mafia for this work is that it provided the CIA with a credible cover story. The Mafia were known to be angry with Castro for closing down their profitable brothels and casinos in Cuba. If the assassins were killed or captured, the media would accept that the Mafia were working on their own. We now know that the Mafia played along in order to get protection from the FBI. At least 9 plots were hatched by the CIA for Castro's assassination, but they all failed. There is every indication that President Eisenhower greatly feared the CIA corporate behemoth that he had allowed to get so out of control during his presidency, although he had done nearly nothing to rein it in. The outgoing president devoted much of his parting speech to warning America of the dangers of the military-industrial complex.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
And so it is in this atmosphere that President John F. Kennedy is inaugurated in January 1961. Kennedy leaves no doubt that he rejects the certitude of war with the Soviet Union that the military and CIA is so convinced of.
Let both sides seek to invoke the wonders of science instead of its terrors. Together, let us explore the stars, conquer the deserts, eradicate disease, tap the ocean depth, and encourage the arts and commerce. Let both sides unite to heed in all corners of the earth the command of Isaiah to undo the heavy burdens and let the oppressed go free. And if a beachhead of cooperation may push back the jungle of suspicion, let both sides join in creating a new endeavor, not a new balance of power, but a new world of law, where the strong are just and the weak secure, and the peace preserved.
But before he can begin to execute his own administration's plans for moving forward, he is confronted by the last vestige of the Eisenhower presidency, a plan for exiled Cuban refugees to invade the island hatched under Vice President Richard Nixon and CIA Director Allen Dulles.
So when Kennedy comes into office, with Cuba, he had already been essentially confronted with this Bay of Pigs operation, which had been set up during the Eisenhower administration. He had all kinds of questions about it, which Allen Dulles was very reluctant to answer. Well, the Bay of Pigs turned out to be a disaster. You know, it was, and in fact, the most recent scholarship on the Bay of Pigs says it was never really meant to succeed. And what was really meant to do was for it to fail, and then Kennedy would have to, under the pressure of defeat, he would then have to call in the Navy, which just happened to be in the area at that time, to save the day. Well, Kennedy didn't do that. And much to everybody's shock and surprise, he went ahead and accepted the defeat, right? And so, but after this, he did an investigation of the whole Bay of Pigs operation. And he came to the conclusion that he was snookered, and therefore he then fired the whole top level of the Central Intelligence Agency. This was Allen Dulles, this was Dick Bissell, who was the director of plans, and Lieutenant Director Charles Cabell.
In the 3 years JFK was in office, he became perhaps the most respected and popular president in U.S. history. JFK reduced the tensions of the Cold War, while at the same time solidified the U.S. strategic position against the Soviets. He called on the American people to come together as a community and serve the country as a whole. He started the Peace Corps. He began a space program that led to a manned moon mission later in the decade. He worked hard to end segregation, and he prohibited discrimination in the sale or lease of housing. Kennedy successfully fought the powerful Texas oil millionaires and their representatives in Congress. He stood up and bested steel company executives when they reneged on an agreement not to inflate prices recklessly. Americans and people around the world saw his desire to stop poor people from being manipulated by powerful interests was genuine. Mostly people trusted him to champion their desire for simple fairness. Kennedy took the initiative and began a back-channel series of letter writing with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The letters led to each man understanding and respecting the other, and both men realized they were each surrounded by military advisors that understood only war. It was this personal relationship between JFK and Premier Khrushchev that quite possibly saved the world from nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. The Soviets had secretly begun to build bases and deploy nuclear weapons in Cuba as a response to U.S. bases and nuclear weapons in Turkey and Italy. For 13 days, military advisors on both sides pushed for confrontation, but Kennedy and Khrushchev worked out a solution that satisfied both countries and averted a nuclear catastrophe. The world realized that the two leaders had accomplished the only logical, sane solution to one of the most dangerous times in world history. But military code warriors like American General Curtis LeMay accused JFK of cowardice. LeMay seemed to prefer a nuclear exchange, which he felt was inevitable.
And Kennedy learned a very, very difficult lesson during the whole Bay of Pigs thing, in that he learned that not to trust his advisors, that a lot of his advisors didn't have the same kind of interest that he did. So then during the Cuban Missile Crisis, again, he does not accept their advice, because almost everybody wanted him to either invade the island or launch airstrikes against the missile silos. Well, he did neither, and in fact, he went for the least provocative solution, which was the blockade, and at the same time, he had a back channel, through his brother to the Russians, and that's the way the dispute was settled.
On November 21, 1963, a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, with his popularity at an all-time high, the President and First Lady left for their 2-day Texas trip. President and Mrs. Kennedy arrive in San Antonio, where a large crowd enthusiastically waits to greet them. The presidential party then motorcades to Brooks Air Force Base, where the president makes a speech.
To the fact that we do stand on the edge of a great new era, filled with both crisis and opportunity, an era to be characterized by achievement and by challenge.
Then it's on to Houston, where JFK attends a testimonial dinner at Rice University Stadium, honoring Congressman Albert Thomas.
Growth has meant new opportunities for this state. Progress has meant new achievements. And we dare not look back now.
And finally, on to Fort Worth, where the President and Mrs. Kennedy spend the night at the Texas Hotel. President Kennedy started his final day with a Chamber of Commerce breakfast speech at the Texas Hotel. Just like the rest of the Texas city's JFK visits, the crowds in Fort Worth are extremely enthusiastic. From Fort Worth, it will be a short plane ride from Carswell Air Force Base to Dallas's Love Field. Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy will motorcade to the Dallas Trade Mart, where the president will make a luncheon speech. As the presidential motorcade leaves Love Field, JFK is unaware of certain events in and around Dallas over the past several months regarding the man who will soon be accused of killing him. In the 2 months preceding JFK's trip to Dallas, Lee Oswald, or someone impersonating him, had been spotted at least 10 times in the area. Each time he made sure his behavior was exaggerated and conspicuous so that people would remember him. On November 1st, 1963, the same time the Chicago plot was unraveling, Oswald, or more likely an imposter, was making a scene at Morgan's gun shop in Fort Worth. According to witness Dewey Bradford, the man was loud, rude, and impertinent, and made a point of telling him that he had been in the Marine Corps. Bradford was in the store with his wife and brother-in-law, and they all felt that the Oswald they saw on television and in the press after the assassination was the ex-Marine that had been so vocal that day in buying ammunition for his rifle. In mid-afternoon the next day, November 2nd, a young man walked into the Lincoln Mercury dealership near Dealey Plaza in Dallas. He told salesman Albert Bogard he was interested in a Mercury Comet, and that although he didn't have money for a down payment, he would be coming into money in the next 2 or 3 weeks and would pay for the car in cash. The man claiming to be Oswald then took Bogard for a wild, erratic test drive on Stemmons Freeway. Upon returning, he acted angry at Bogard and fellow salesman Eugene Wilson when told he would need credit to buy the car. He said maybe he would have to go back to Russia to buy a car. At the Sportsdrome shooting range in Dallas on November 10th, Malcolm Price will identify Lee Harvey Oswald as the man who asked him to sight his rifle scope for him, and then fired 3 consecutive bullseyes at a very difficult target with nearly no daylight left. 1 week later, on November 17th, Garland Slack finished putting up his target when a man turned his rifle on it, emptying his magazine. When Slack objected strenuously, the man who he said was Lee Harvey Oswald to the Warren Commission gave him a look that he said he would never forget. The most investigated and important Oswald sighting came in the last week of September 1963. Sylvia Odio, a 26-year-old Cuban immigrant living in Dallas, was visited at her apartment door by 3 men. 2 of the men looked Latin and spoke rapidly in Spanish. One of these men gave his underground exile name as Leopoldo and the other Angel. The third man, an American, was introduced as Leon Oswald. They claimed to be good friends of her father, then being held in a Cuban prison, and said they wanted her to meet Oswald, who was very much interested in their cause. She received a call from Leopoldo 2 days later, asking her what she thought of the American. He told her the American had said that Cubans don't have any guts, and that President Kennedy should have been killed after the Bay of Pigs defeat. Odio said she was getting upset with the phone conversation, but Leopoldo went on, saying that the American said killing JFK could be done, and that he was a former Marine and expert shot. Sylvia Odio never heard from the men again, and her father informed her that he had never heard of them and to stay away. Odio recognized the American, Leon Oswald, as the man who had been accused of shooting JFK, and informed the FBI. Odio was not called before the Warren Commission until nearly the end of their investigation, and although they admitted every aspect of her story checked out, they said it could not have been Lee Oswald, as he was in Mexico at the time. The Warren Commission would ignore the gun shop sighting by Dewey Bradford totally. Likewise, the Warren Commission would dismiss the FBI reports from Alfred Bogard and Eugene Wilson at the Lincoln Mercury dealership, saying that Oswald could not drive and he apparently was elsewhere that day. As far as the reports and testimony from Malcolm Price and Garland Slack at the Sportsdrome shooting range, incredibly, once again, the Warren Commission will say both men must have been mistaken. In all 3 cases, as well as the uninvited visit to Sylvia Odio, the Warren Commission will leave uninvestigated the obvious explanation that Oswald had been impersonated in all cases. We now know that Leopoldo was almost certainly Bernardo de Torres, a Bay of Pigs participant and CIA contract employee. In just a few years, de Torres will infiltrate and try to destroy New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison's own investigation into the JFK assassination. Further, in an almost impossible-to-believe scenario, de Torres will be called by the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1976, but be given immunity by the CIA, and the investigators were not allowed to ask him anything about the time leading up to Kennedy's assassination. Further, Silvia Odio's father was a member of JOR, a Cuban exile group favored by the Kennedys to take over in the case of Castro's overthrow, but greatly disliked by the CIA. The agency seemed to be trying to implicate Oswald and JOR in the JFK assassination with the objective of eliminating both.